Well, we have been making our way through the book of Genesis here as a church for about a year and a half. And today is our last Sunday in Genesis. And I thought it was very fitting to close the book of Genesis on this passage, specifically the one that was just read by Seth. We're going to be taking chapter 49, verse 29, all the way through chapter 50 through 26. If you're new to the Bible, just a reminder that the big numbers are the chapters and the little numbers are the verses. So we're going to start in chapter 49, look for that big number, and then the little number 29. So I'm excited to be able to wrap up the book of Genesis with a message from God that I trust is exactly what you need to hear today. I wonder what word you would use, one word that you might use to summarize Easter. Obvious one would be like resurrection. Maybe you would give the Sunday school answer, Jesus. Or maybe you would say joy. I wonder what those who are not Christians might say. Maybe you're not a Christian. What would you say? Maybe you might say family. Whatever Easter summarizes for you, what would that be? One word, we could say many, but one word that comes to mind that just has stuck in my head as I've been anticipating this day is this: hope. More than any other holiday that we celebrate, Easter is a holiday of hope. Why? Listen to the words of Tim Keller, pastor and author. He said it this way: if Jesus Christ was actually raised from the dead, if he really got up, really walked out of the tomb, really was seen by hundreds of people, talked to them, then you know what? Everything's going to be all right. Whatever you're worried about right now, whatever you're afraid of, everything is actually going to be okay. Tim Keller died of cancer not long after saying that. And he said that because he knew he had cancer and he didn't have much longer to live. You know what that's called? Hope. I wonder if you have it. Do you have hope? You may have heard it said there's only two certainties in life: death and what? Taxes. The deadline for one of those is coming really soon. And the reality is, you don't know which one. You might die before April 15th. Death has a way of sobering us to the all-important question: do I have hope? Do I have hope beyond this life, beyond death? Is this all there is? That's what this closing passage in the book of Genesis answers for us. The passage here is laid out like a sandwich, or maybe we should say a hamburger, because some of you are going to be eating some hamburgers this afternoon. You think of a hamburger, you have, at its core, you have the two pieces of bread, and then what's in the middle? The main thing is the meat, the whole point of the hamburger, right? The bread is just there to support the juiciness and beauty and glory, whatever, of the meat. I'm a meat guy. I say if you have a meal without meat, it's not a meal, it's a snack. So meat. So you have in this passage, the top passage is kind of the first piece of bread. The bottom part of the passage is the bottom piece of bread. And then the middle of the passage, when passages in the Bible are structured like that, it means the author is doing that on purpose to show what is most important, what he wants you really to hear, what he wants you really to chew on and taste: the meat. And what we just read a moment ago is the meat of the passage. In the first part, you have a man who's on his deathbed, Jacob. And people mourn his death, but they mourn with hope. And then the bottom part of the passage, the bottom piece of bread, another guy dies. He's on his deathbed and he dies. And it's Joseph. That's Jacob's son. And he dies in hope. And the question that we should be asking is, how can you die in hope? How can you face death with hope? That's what the meat answers. That's what the middle part of the passage answers. So we're going to take, here's what I want to do. We're going to take the two pieces of bread first. Bread number one, bread number two, and then we're going to close with eating that meat, okay? That's where we're going. I'm going to ask three questions. Three questions. You can follow along in the worship guide. Should be found there in your worship guide, the outline, if that's helpful for you. Some people like to take notes. Some people just want to listen. I would encourage all of us to listen with Bible open. Follow along, because we're going to be working through this passage verse by verse. Three questions. Number one, do you have hope when others die? Number two, will you have hope when you die? And number three, what gives you hope in life and death? So number one, do you have hope when others die? We're going to be looking at chapter 49, beginning in verse 29. Jacob, the father of the people of Israel, he's on his deathbed here, okay? He and his whole family, they're currently in the land of Egypt because a famine that really covered all surrounding nations was spreading, and it forced Jacob and his family out of their homeland, which is Canaan, the land that God promised to be a place of rest for the people of Jacob, the people of Israel. About 40 years prior, however, Jacob's son, Joseph, was sold into slavery by his older brothers because they were jealous of the favoritism that Jacob showed to Joseph. Like, we got to get rid of this kid, and they sold him into slavery. That was like 40 years prior to this event here. Through a series of just what can only be described as miraculous events, Joseph in Egypt ends up becoming the second most powerful man in the known world because he becomes the right-hand man of Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, king of Egypt. So when the famine hit, Joseph then invites his whole family from Canaan to come down to Egypt to be saved from the famine because there was food in Egypt. And they've been there for about 17 years. Jacob, the head of Israel, he is about to die, but he's about to die in Egypt. That's a problem because God promised Jacob and Jacob's offspring would inherit the land of Canaan, the land that was languishing and they had to leave, the land that represents God's presence and God's rest for God's people. So I want you to consider, as Jacob faces death in Egypt, consider the hope that he has, even as he faces death outside of the promised land. So here, he's speaking to his sons. Chapter 49, verse 29. Then he, that is Jacob, commanded them, that's his sons, and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron, the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with a field from Ephron, the Hittite, to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. So he's referring here to the burial site that his great-grandfather Abraham bought many years prior in the land of promise, the land of Canaan, because Abraham wanted to ensure that his people could be buried there. And Jacob is saying, bury me there. Don't let my body remain here in Egypt. I'm going to die here, but I want you to take my body back to the promised land. Take my body home. Why? Now, this is a big ask because where he was in Egypt to where Canaan is about 250 miles. You wouldn't hop on a plane and carry his body through the air. They didn't have it then. This was by foot, by caravan. But Jacob was sure that he needed to be buried there. Look at verse 33. Here comes his death. Verse 33. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Now that's a very interesting phrase. He breathed his last and then was gathered to his people. He would not be buried in that cave where his dad and grandpa, their bodies are, wouldn't be for another 3 months or so. And yet it says here, as soon as he breathed his last, he was gathered to his people. How can he say that? How can it say that? The answer is something happened to him after his body died. His inner man, his soul, was gathered to his people. In other words, death is not the end. He knew that. His family knows that, even though when he dies, they grieve tremendously. Look at their grief in chapter 50, verse 1. Look at chapter 50, verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Israel's another name for Jacob. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. Now, why embalm? I take it to be that embalming was necessary to preserve his body for that long travel to Canaan. And yet you see here as well what great grief comes with his death. Even all the Egyptians grieving for this man and honoring him even in their grief. The question is, can we grieve and still have hope? When others die, what hope do you have? I want you to see the hope that the author of Genesis, who, by the way, is Moses, I don't know if you knew that. Moses, the author of Genesis, instills in the original readers of Genesis. So when Moses wrote the book of Genesis, he was writing it to a people that came about much later than what was written here. He was writing about events that happened way before his time. And he's writing to the people who would come from the offspring of the guy who just died, Jacob. The very people who would be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, and yet God got them out of there, and they're on their way back to the promised land. That's who Moses is writing the book of Genesis to. So I want you to see how he instills hope in them. Look at verse 4. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father, then I will return." So Joseph, as the second most powerful person in the world, is asking Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the world, for permission to take his father's body on a 250-mile journey to Canaan. The way he asks this question is very interesting, that would have perked the ears of the original readers. He says, please let me go up. Now, you might just think, well, that's just the direction he's going to have to go. True. But that term, go up, is used 7 times in chapter 50. And when the Bible repeats itself, we should listen. Something's important here about go up. The reason why it's important is because Moses, the author of Genesis, is going to use that same term in the second book he writes. Do you know what the second book is that Moses wrote? Exodus, right after Genesis. And Exodus is all about that grand event where the people of Israel are slaves in Egypt, and God rescues them and brings them out, and they go up to the land of Canaan. That book of Exodus uses that word go up like crazy. Clearly there's an allusion here. Jacob's body is going up from Egypt to Canaan as a way of kind of prefiguring the promise that the people later on will also go up. Because God keeps his promises. He promised he'll take him back. He'll keep his promises. In fact, I want you to notice some other details that demonstrate like Joseph's journey from Egypt to Canaan prefigures Israel's journey later on. Look at verse 6. Verse 6. And Pharaoh said, "Go up," there it is, "and bury your father as he made you swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. So you got a ton of Egyptians that are accompanying the brothers and the people of Israel as they take Jacob's body up to Canaan. Notice this includes chariots and horsemen. Did you see that phrase? This is a hint of what will take place later on in that Exodus event. An army of Egyptians with chariots and horsemen. That term is used again in the book of Exodus. Instead of accompanying the people of Israel, they're going to be chasing after them because they don't want them to leave. Here in Genesis, they're going with them. They'll be chasing them, but they're still taking the same route. I think there's a hint here that something like this is going to take place later on because God keeps his promises. He brings his people home. Notice the route they take. Verse 10. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians." Therefore, the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. So great grief in the midst of loss. No doubt the author is highlighting that. But he's also giving us a detail of where they stopped to grieve. They stopped in a location beyond the Jordan. That is the same path that the people of Israel would take later on. They would cross over the Jordan into the promised land. These little details are designed to give the original reader hope in the face of death. Just as God got Jacob home to the promised land, so too he would get them home. And if you've been with us in our study of Genesis, or if you studied it on your own, you would know that the promised land of Canaan points beyond itself to a greater promise of an eternal land, a new creation where God will dwell with his people forever. That's our hope. And death cannot prevent God's people from getting there. Jacob's family had hope as they buried their dad in the place he told them to. Look at verse 12. Verse 12, "Thus his sons did for him as he commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with a field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone with him to bury his father." They knew this was not the end of their dad. That's why they buried him in the promised land, this place of hope, of eternal life. I wonder if you have that hope when others die. What about, perhaps more importantly, do you have that hope when you die? Will you? On your deathbed? Hopefully you'll be in a place where you can contemplate this and you know you're about to die. Some people don't. They're gone like that. So you got to deal with this now. Do you have this hope now in the face of your own death? I want to jump now to the bottom slice of bread, that bottom bun in this hamburger, in verse 22, that records Joseph's death. So look at verse 22. "So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. Ephraim is his son. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. Now, it was rare to live long enough to see your great-great-grandchildren, but Joseph does, indicating Joseph had a very full life. In fact, in that day, according to Egyptians, 110 years old was the ideal amount of time to live. I don't know why, but for them it indicated fullness. I think that's what it's supposed to indicate here. It was a full life. However, Joseph's life still comes to an end. It doesn't matter if you live 110 years like Joseph or 147 years like his dad Jacob. They both end up dying anyway. We got to reckon with that. We will all take a final breath. And the question remains, will you have hope in the face of it? Look at Joseph's hope. Verse 24. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph is very confident that God will bring the people of Israel home to the promised land. He says, very specifically, he says, God will visit you. That's the same language used in the book of Exodus to describe God coming and rescuing his people out of slavery there 400 years later. Joseph is looking ahead to that. He has hope that God will indeed keep his promises, but he knows it's not going to be for a long time. Look what he says in verse 25. Verse 25, so Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. They're not getting out of Egypt anytime soon if he's telling them to carry his bones from there to the promised land. His body is going to rot and decay in Egypt. So why make this request? He knows Egypt is not his final home. And he wants his remains to be buried in the land of promise because he believes his remains will not remain remains forever. He will be given a new, glorified body that will rise from the dead in the land of promise. He had that hope. Do you? Will you have hope if you're given the grace to be on your deathbed and you still have consciousness? Will you have that hope? How sad it is. So many people are banking on false hopes. I've lived a good enough life. That's my ticket to heaven. To which I would gently ask, what makes you think it's good enough? What makes you think you've reached the standard of goodness to get there? Or you might say, well, God will just overlook all the wrong I've done, and he's going to let me in. Again, to which I ask, why? That sounds unjust to me. God is not unjust. He doesn't just overlook wrongdoing. You don't want a God like that who turns a blind eye to wrong. You may only want him to do that to you, not for anyone else. But God is not unjust. He cannot just sweep wrongdoing under the rug. You might say, well, doesn't everyone just go to a better place? To which I would ask, where do we get that idea from? What gives you hope? True hope in the face of death. What are you banking on? The answer to that question is in the juicy meat of this passage. So let's ask that question. What gives you hope in life and death? Look at this exchange. We read it just a little bit ago, but this exchange between Joseph and his brothers right after their dad's funeral and shortly before Joseph ends up dying. Look at verse 15. Verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. What are they talking about? Do you know what they did to him? I alluded to it earlier. Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold as a slave to Egypt. For 22 years, he was away from his homeland. His father thought he was dead the whole time. He had to go to a foreign land, learn the culture, learn the language. He was mistreated. He was falsely accused. He was even imprisoned there. What his brothers did to him was horrible. And it led to even more horrible things happening to him. And now that their dad is dead and Joseph has the power he does in Egypt, they fear he's going to take revenge, even though he already said he forgave him back in chapter 45. But when we do really bad things, one of the hardest things to believe is that we can be forgiven. So what do? They come up with a fabricated story to appease Joseph's potential wrath. Look at verse 16. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave us this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you." And now this is them talking after they give that message. "And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Jacob never said this. Their dad never said this. Fear makes people fabricate stories. This is one of the reasons why we lie. So a lot of times when we lie, it's because we're fearful of the consequences of the truth. Rather than trusting God with the truth, let's make up our own to protect ourselves, and that's what they're doing here. What do you think? How do you think Joseph's going to respond? Do you think he's going to be like, "What in the world is wrong with you guys? I'm so frustrated. I told you I forgave you. Stop making this all about you." Is that his response? Verse 17, end of verse 17, it says, Joseph wept when they spoke to him. I mean, he just wept. He wept at the thought that they thought he was still vengeful in his thoughts towards them. Again, and it's just them bringing this up again probably just opened these old relational wounds that he thought maybe were healed. And it's like, guys, I thought we were on good terms now. What is the deal? And he just bawls his eyes out. But they're still really desperate. Notice what they do in verse 18. Verse 18. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." I wonder if you'd be frustrated. Joseph is not frustrated. Notice what he says in verse 19. This is so important. Verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God?" I want you to see this connection. They fear that he's going to punish them by death because of what they did to him. And he says, "Don't fear, because I'm not in the place of God." What does that imply? What does that imply about Joseph's view of God's relationship to death? Does it not imply death is God's business? God's the one who's ultimately in charge of death. I'm not going to step in his place. Isn't that what's implied? Joseph is trusting in the sovereignty, that's a fancy word for the control of God over death. That's why he could face his own death with hope. That's why he faced his dad's death with hope. And that's why he's not going to take vengeance on his brothers and put them to death, because God is sovereign over death. And if God is sovereign over death, then that must mean he's sovereign over everything. Do you know why? I alluded to it earlier. Death is sovereign over every person. Everyone dies, and there's no stopping it. As much as people try to stop death or delay death with our anti-aging creams or frequent trips to the doctor, or some of us purposely don't go to the doctor Because we have this illusion that if we don't hear something bad, then there must be nothing bad happening in my body. And so we just want to remain ignorant in an illusion to have control over death. But death, we all know, remains sovereign over us. And therefore, if God is sovereign over death, then he must be sovereign over everything. That's the very point that Joseph goes on to make to his brothers. Look at verse 20. Verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. You, brothers, when you sold me into slavery all those years ago, you did it from an evil, jealous, wicked heart. Notice, he's not excusing their sin. Sovereignty of God doesn't excuse man's sin. We are totally responsible for our sin. He's acknowledging it. You meant evil in that act of selling me into slavery. You're totally responsible for what you did because your intention in that was evil. But there was a deeper intention. But God meant it for good. That, I would propose to you, is hope. There is meaning to your suffering that often feels meaningless. God meant it, intended it, purposed it for good. What's the it? You meant evil, God meant it. They're evil for good. There were two actors at play in Joseph being sold into slavery. His brothers acted wickedly because their hearts were wicked. And God, who acted good because his heart was good. What was the good that God intended? Did you see it in verse 20? It says at the end of verse 20, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. You know what he's talking about? Joseph became the instrument through which Egypt and many surrounding nations were saved from this famine. If you take any of the events in Joseph's life, even down to the smallest detail, if you take any of that away, millions would have died. It began with his dad's favoritism towards him that fueled his brother's jealousy towards him. Then it happened with Joseph dreaming that his brothers would one day bow down to him. And when they heard about that, they got even angrier and they wanted to kill him. They were ready to kill him. Well, that would have done away with this. But you know what happened? The oldest brother had a little bit of a conscience and he intervened and said, let's not kill him, let's just throw him in a pit. And he was hoping to come back to him and rescue him. Well, that didn't happen because some Midianite traders that were on their way down to Egypt just so happened to be passing by right at the time when their oldest brother wasn't there. And their greediness in their hearts began to be aroused. And they're like, you know what? Yeah, let's not kill him. Let's sell him. Make a few bucks. And they sold him as a slave to Egypt. And he became, just so happened, to become a servant. He landed in Potiphar's house. And Potiphar just happened to have a wife who was a little floozy. And she came on to Joseph. But he, in godliness, resisted her. And she falsely accused him of rape, and that landed him in prison. Which just so happened to be the same prison that two of Pharaoh's, the king of Egypt, two of his servants were also in. And then they had some disturbing dreams that they thought might have some meaning to that. And Joseph said, tell them to me. God will give you an interpretation. And Joseph was able to tell them what the dreams meant. One guy in a few days is going to be killed. You're going to be punished by Pharaoh. The other guy is going to be restored to his office. And that's exactly what happened. But 2 years later, the guy who was restored to his office heard that Pharaoh had a dream as well. Very disturbing to Pharaoh. He says, "Is there any meaning to this?" And this guy, his servant, says, "Oh, I know a guy. 2 years before, he gave meaning to one of my dreams. Maybe he can help you." And so they brought Joseph out of Egypt and stood him before the most powerful person in the world, Pharaoh. And Pharaoh told him his dream. And the dream ended up being a vision of the future, a vision that included a famine was on its way. Joseph told him that. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "You're in charge. I'm putting you in charge of gathering up food for these next 7 years before the famine hits 7 years after that, so that there's food and we survive." And as a result of that, millions of people survived. Every single detail in Joseph's life mattered, including all his suffering. God was doing 1,000 things behind the scenes that Joseph couldn't see. God is doing 10,000 things behind the scenes in your life that you can't see. And he is working it together for the good of his people. I want you to realize this. The story of Joseph teaches us that God doesn't pick up the pieces of a mess that we've made and try to make something out of it. That's not what this means. The mess itself is indeed part of his plan. There's a book that my kids really like called Mistakes That Worked. It's a book about famous inventions that happened by accident, like the chocolate chip cookie. Did you know that was an accident? A glorious accident. Ruth Wakefield, in 1938, the year that this church was founded, she was trying to make some chocolate cookies, and she ran out of baker's chocolate, which was meant to make the whole dough chocolatey. So she thought, I'll just put little chunks of chocolate in there and it'll just kind of spread throughout and become a chocolate cookie. Instead, the pieces of chocolate stayed in place and just became gooey goodness. It was a mistake that worked out for the good of all mankind. Now that is how many people think our life works. That's how they think God works. Mistakes happen, God just makes the best of it. Not true. God designed that there would be chunks of chocolate put in there so you get chocolate chip cookies. Do you get it? Do you get the analogy? God is always, it's all a part of his plan. He's always working his plan out. He's not trying to clean up messes. He's totally in control. You don't want a God like that. It's like, oh man, what do I do with this? How can you trust him to work it out for good if he was totally out of control and absent in the bad? What you meant for evil, God meant for good. The clearest example we have of this really is found in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I want you to hear how some of Jesus' followers prayed in Acts chapter 4. Listen to what they say. Truly in this city we're gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel. So in other words, these people were against Jesus. They were ones who put him to death, right? Yeah. But then they go on to say this. They were gathered against him to do whatever your hand, God, and your plan predestined to take place. This is talking about the cross. The most wicked act by men in the history of the world, the killing of Jesus, was actually a part of God's plan. Why? To bring about the salvation of many. Do you see? As for you, Herod and Pontius Pilate, you meant evil against Jesus, but God meant it for good, to bring salvation to sinners. This is why Jesus died. The men who put him to death had no clue that God was working salvation for sinners like you and me. That's what happened at the cross. Jesus willingly went there and took the punishment that we sinners deserve to take, because God is holy and just. He said he can't sweep sin under the rug. He's got to deal with our sin problem. But he loves us so much, and he's so merciful that he wants to let us off the hook. How can he do that? How can he be just and loving? The answer is the cross of Jesus Christ. And it was all designed by God. It was all part of his plan. They meant evil against Jesus, but God meant it for good, for you and for me. The cross saves us. The cross is what gives us forgiveness. The cross paid our penalty for sin. And you know that though Jesus died, death could not defeat him. Why? Because he is sovereign over death, and he proved it by walking out of the tomb. And if he is sovereign over death, he is sovereign over everything, including all of the hard things you've gone through in your life. God means it for good. Would you trust that? Maybe you're not yet a Christian. Can I just appeal to you? Trust in Jesus Christ today. Trust in this God who works all things together for good. Our only hope in life and death is the God who is sovereign over both. Surrender. Oh, that we would surrender any illusion we think we have that we're in control of our lives. Surrender it to the one who has control. And come and rest in the sovereign goodness of God revealed in his Son, Jesus Christ. Hope, true hope, is found in him. Amen.